Greetings, future fossils. Michael Garfield here, reporting to you from Byron Bay, Australia at Paradise One, where I sat in last night on my friend Adam Scott Miller's visionary art retreat with some live musical performance to facilitate the last night of painting. As I approach the end of this month-long tour of Australia's transformational festivals and innovation hubs, got a lot to reflect on, a lot of interesting perspectives to share. But one of the themes that keeps coming back over and over is this notion of the vision that we shape for posterity, the kind of communities we want to leave in place for those unborn generations. So it seems like a totally resonant moment to publish this talk with Tibet Sprague, a friend I met at Boom Festival in Portugal last summer. It's just about 6 months to the day since I encountered him in the Liminal Village Speaker Series tent. And it's a delight to share this chat with him about how to take a perspective on our role as ancestors and the inheritance of the profound effort, love, and vision of the generations who came before us. And before I launch you into this episode, just a reminder to subscribe, rate, and review this show on iTunes or Stitcher, wherever you listen to it. It's a huge help to us on the podcast for getting this program into the ears of everyone who will benefit from it. Of course, if you would like to support this podcast, as well as all of the other work that I'm doing to hack our culture for the benefit of all beings, you can get up on patreon.com/Michael Garfield and be the first to know anytime I have some new nugget of writing or music or art, whichever media your senses most delight in. It makes a huge difference in terms of the time I'm able to devote to each episode. I'd like to get this podcast up to once a week and to shift my emphasis from hustling art to facilitating conversations that usher us into a deeper and wider now from which we can collaboratively mastermind the most effective, beautiful, and tasty futures we can possibly send children into. Lastly, you are one of many awesome people listening to this show, and if you'd like to meet the rest of them, we have a Facebook group. Just look up Future Fossils there and find us and hop in, and we'll be glad to have you. And with that, let's start the show. Greetings, everybody. Welcome to Future Fossils Podcast. I am your host, Michael Garfield. This week, our guest is Tibet Sprague, who I met at Boom Festival earlier this year, and who immediately caught my attention with his very interesting questions at the Liminal Village group stuff. So you're just going to have to accept that that the man is full of good ideas.
Well, thank you.
Yeah,
Happy
welcome on board, Tibet.
Yeah, very exciting.
Yeah, so I acquainted myself a little bit with your upbringing because, a big part of this podcast is envisioning the future of our species and, future social organizations and cultural modes. And so I was really interested in some of the essays that you've posted on Medium about your experience with intentional communities and including your upbringing in a sort of loosely affiliated intentional community. So maybe we should just start about your childhood and how you kind of came to care about the things that you care about today.
Yeah, sure. So I feel very privileged, honestly, very lucky to have grown up in real community and surrounded by many adults that weren't my parents, that I knew, that I was friends with, that I could go to, and that were really experimenting with and exploring living in community and kind of, new culture, as it were, and doing a lot of kind of social experimentation and exploring their own psyches and relationship models and communication models and spirituality. So, at the time, of course, as a child, it's kind of, you're just in the water that you're in. You don't really know that it's different or weird or interesting. It's kind of just the world that you're in. But it was a wonderful way to grow up with lots of community around me. And so specifically, I lived on a street where I could walk up the road to one of the earliest eco-villages called Sirius Community. Sirius like the star, not like the way of being. And there was a number of community homes up the street. And then there was a community called Friends and Lovers that was started by some of my parents' friends that would gather for long weekends 2 or 3 times a year and have like a mini festival, although, smaller scale and much more focused on just connection and play. And there was a lot of, family over time as the community had more and more children. And so, from a very early age, I loved this community, and I wanted to figure out how to create that for myself and for my children, and kind of iterate on the experiments and exploration that my parents' generation had done. So now I'm trying to really, in some ways, begin. I mean, it's been a lifelong process, but also right now really want to begin manifesting very concrete community in my life and around me, and help other people do that as well.
So how is that? I mean, when you talk about your Bay Area community, it just seems that every time I visit the Bay, it's becoming more and more inimical to human existence. That it's like, it's just becoming this, people are getting priced out. People are reporting their dissatisfaction with the way that the whole scene is going down there. And yet, to read your stuff, it sounds like there's still a lot of hope and promise, and people that are really engaged in some very progressive work there. So what is the status of that right now for you, with your boots on the ground over there?
Yeah, it's an interesting question, and it's something I think about all the time. It's, a big part of my daily life. I've been here in San Francisco for 7 years now, and really, a lot has changed over those 7 years, but really over the last 3 years or so, I'd say, is when, tech began to move in a really big way. Since I've been here, of course, there's been many of these cycles in San Francisco and in other places. But, San Francisco in particular has had this huge wave of tech and, Google workers and Facebook and Apple wanting to live in the city. And it's very real. And a lot of the artists have left, and a lot of, the people who are not in tech have had to move, and many families have been evicted. And it is depressing. I have some close friends who grew up here, and they really are just deeply saddened by it and struggling with it. And the Bay Area as a whole, it still has so much going on. And, a lot of the artists, a lot of the musicians moved to Oakland. I mean, it's just kind of across the Bay. And it is a difference. Being in San Francisco feels different. And I end up spending a lot more time in Berkeley and Oakland. But there's still, across the entire Bay Area, so much richness and exploration, kind of the cutting edge of culture, I would say, across so many areas. Of course, technology, but also, in terms of love and relationships and sex, and just, all areas of culture. I still feel like this is a rich place to be, with a lot of cutting edge exploration happening. I myself am wanting to start a community home in the next 6 months, and think I'll probably end up in Oakland because that's where most of my friends are. That's where it's still slightly more reasonable to be, although still pretty expensive. And there's a huge culture of, kind of social justice organizations, environmental organizations in downtown Oakland. And it's really a pretty amazing energy there right now. There's still a lot happening here, and I'm also excited to explore the world and see that, a lot of the things I care about and are spreading around the world. And, maybe people that have had to leave the Bay Area have gone to other cities and other places and brought new ideas. And I think it's great to have some of that kind of dissemination of things happening and intermixing of ideas from different places. So, I still feel pretty committed to the Bay Area. My tribe is still here, and I'm going to try and continue to keep it cool as much as I can. Keep it weird, keep it cool.
I was just talking about this last night with somebody about algorithmic news feed editing and location specific search results, and this notion that even though we were sold on the internet as a way to collapse space and time, in a weird inversion, it seems like it's actually bringing us into, or it's coming around now to a point where it's bringing us into a more of an engagement with our local environments, and or a different and deeper kind of engagement. And it's like that there's this, all of us have this sort of thin, gauzy, planet-wide layer of friends and acquaintances. But then when you talk about where's my tribe, and it's still here, and there's still this sense of like, even if I wanted to, and we definitely should get to the time that you spent at Tamera this summer. Even if I felt like such extraordinary resonance with a community that's going on another continent, the cost, this like social cost of uprooting oneself and relocating to Europe, from the United States, or to the US from Australia or whatever, it still seems like that hasn't gone away. It's still really the case that it's the people around you, it's your immediate environment that is sort of most critical.
Yeah. As much as the internet has allowed different subgroups and subcultures to form and connect, and for people to kind of, I think, find their tribe in a new way, especially those that maybe don't feel like they connect with where they grew up. That's great, and that's wonderful. And I think there's a certain kind of human relationship and connection and sustainability in both in how we live on the planet, but also how we live for ourselves and in our culture, that only really happens in face-to-face interpersonal relationship and connection over time. And so I think there's so much value in finding a place to be and to settle and to commit to a local community, and putting your energy and effort into building up that community and really being a part of it. And I think, there's various ways in which our current culture doesn't support that. I mean, obviously we can get into sort of the deep layer of how our culture is focused on, just independence and individualism, and the ways that has destroyed community and is not healthy. But even beyond that, I think there's a little bit of a sense of, and maybe even in our community, that, you can kind of pick up and travel and go and explore and be a nomad and tap into this global community and people who are into whatever you're into, be it festival culture or any sort of subculture you're a part of, and travel and connect with that. And I think that's an important part of the growth process for individuals to explore. There's a couple problems. One is that it's not really sustainable, flying around the world a lot. And, you hear a lot of people talking about this sort of digital nomad lifestyle and traveling from community to community. And I'm actually really into that vision and that idea. And I do think it's also important for spreading ideas. Like, I have some friends who are envisioning a kind of modern Silk Road where you have communities around the world that you are a part of, almost like a virtual nation or a sort of virtual community that you can like travel and connect with different places and spread ideas and share ideas. And I like that idea, but I do think it's sort of a little selfish in some ways and not sustainable for the globe, and that it's really a time to for many of us to really come back to our local community and our local tribe, wherever that is, or work to create that if we don't feel like we have that in our lives.
There's something in this that I feel is a tension in society, like regardless of the age, that there's this tension between the empowerment of freedom and the ability to get up and walk away. If you look at the revolution of like women entering the workforce in America, and how the economic empowerment of that enabled women to choose whether or not they're going to remain in an abusive relationship, or whether they're going to remain that dependency. But then there's this other side of it, which is that there's something seems lost. Like when people talk about extropian singularitarian types talk about freedom from the body, like escaping the limitations of the flesh. And this notion that like in the high of true and total transcendence, you're not actually transcending your own escapist urges, and that like really only transcending suffering. I mean, if you want to get into like a more of a Buddhist framework for this, like you got Theravadan Buddhism that's like get off the wheel of suffering.
Right.
But then you got Mahayana Buddhism that says the illusion of escape is part of the suffering.
Yeah.
And that there's, you really only find true freedom through embracing the difficulty and like actually engaging with the challenges, and that maybe what people are seeking on the road is something that you can really only find at home. By really digging in with these neighbors that you hate.
Right. Absolutely. Yeah. There's a lot in what you just said that sort of sparks a sort of set of related tensions that I feel like I've been noticing a lot. And I think where to go with it initially, I think I definitely have been exploring and trying to think through this idea of freedom that we currently have. I think our American society is built on this foundation of freedom, or independence.
The rhetoric of freedom, anyway.
A rhetoric of freedom, yeah. And what does that really mean? I think people hold on to that as like, oh, well, this is the foundation of our society, so I need to be able to do what I want to do, like have my guns, be free of government control in some way. But of course, it's just some set of agreements about what our society has decided it means to be free. Like there's a certain like list of things. Of course, our society doesn't say you're free to kill someone or take someone's property, or there's such a huge list of rules. We're not actually that free within our society. It's just a sort of specific things and a rhetoric and a attachment to this idea of freedom. But like true freedom to me is more of like a feeling. It's more like, am I allowed to be and express the fullness of who I am and who I want to be in the world, and how I want to show up? And I think we're not actually able to do that in our society. So many people are kind of held back and restricted from authentically expressing themselves, first of all, because of practical reasons, like maybe racism, sexism, maybe they're incarcerated because of something they did that is against the specific set of rules we've agreed on. But also a lot of it is this internal holding back because our society has some specific set of norms and we don't feel like, it's okay to express ourselves. And so where am I going with this? I mean, it's sort of just it's almost just like a line of thought. I'm trying to figure out how to reconceptualize this idea of freedom in a way that leads to a society where vast majority of people actually feel free to be who they want to be. And a huge part of that is also things like a universal basic income and eliminating homophobia and sexism and racism institutionally and culturally, so that everyone has the means and the resources and the ability and the sort of permission from society to actually be free. But of course, at the same time, ultimately, there is a tension between freedom and sort of community and society, right? Like we can't have full, complete freedom. And so I feel like I've been trying to think about like in wanting to redesign our culture, you have to kind of prioritize. Like you have to say, okay, these are the values of our society, and like freedom is a very important one. But to me, the thing that has to come first that hasn't and doesn't in our current envisioning of our culture is community, and is coming together to create a world that works for everyone and create a society that works for the 100%. So there's sort of this tension, and ultimately it gets worked out by humans in relationship, and by a legal system, right? Like kind of navigates these tensions between different societies, different prioritized values. But I think we've got this warped sense of freedom and how it is primary and needs to come before anything else, that has led to many of our problems in our society. So that's one line of thinking that that you sparked.
Well, so today, this seems to be floating around in the air because we just got some new roommates. The two new roommates that came in are much more community and cooperative living minded. Very explicitly, like, let's get some compost going, let's do food gardens, I'm going to buy a dry erase board, let's delegate our chores, let's do this stuff. And it's actually really inspiring. And we've got one corner of the communal dry erase board now devoted to inspirational quotes, which is, you know, and my buddy Charlie, one of the new roommates, put up Paramahamsa Yogananda quote that said, "Environment is stronger than will," which is sort of a performative of his actual like role in this household, the way that the social molecule adjusts the same way that the adding or removing atoms or attachments to a molecule adjusts the balance of electrical charges and like literally morphs the three-dimensional structure of it. I feel like I'm a different person with different roommates. I feel like, when you get into that level of it, and the issue of how our individual drives and desires are actually sculpted by the agencies of our environments and the people with whom we surround ourselves. And it becomes a much fuzzier area. Like this tension is sort of an illusion, because really like the things that I care about are the things that I was imprinted to care about growing up, and the things that I care about through my interactions with my peer groups and my mentors. And so, of course, I had to one of the things that I was imprinted with growing up was the desire to be a devil's advocate, pain in the ass. So it felt like the appropriate balancing quotation was, do as thou wilt will be the whole of the law. Love is the law, love under will. The code of Thelema as articulated by Aleister Crowley. And so there's this balance of where it is that our individual essence, our personality, that thing that we strive to express freely, is itself constrained or even outright just created by our relationships. And so it gets, this is where it gets into this, one of the things that you mentioned is, interest in using blockchain to decentralize our various, parts of our system and build out some, maybe the basis for a universal basic income and this kind of thing. And it's like, it seems like blockchain and these other very like decentralized or decentralizing technologies are the medium that's offering us the specific message about a new sense of self-construction that recognizes the self as emergent from relational dynamics.
Yeah, I mean, I'm certainly very curious to follow what's happening in the blockchain world, and I think it's a really important, powerful technology as we move forward. I've gotten a little less attached to the blockchain specifically. I mean, I absolutely think that decentralization is a hugely important piece of the future in terms of how we make decisions, governance, sort of autonomy of local communities and regions to support themselves in terms of like food and water and, basic need, energy. And, just having a world where individuals and communities are much more empowered and much more, able to, not only like live without some sort of, bigger hierarchical sort of dominant system telling them what to do, but are really living their passion and thriving in the world in this sort of empowered way. And I think the blockchain is a technology that can help us get there in many ways, because that decentralization is kind of built into the structure of the technology. However, I mean, there's an example recently with the DAO. It was called this Decentralized Autonomous Organization, where a group of people very fundamental in the blockchain community wanted to create one of these first big companies completely in a decentralized way, where anyone who bought into this company became kind of like a shareholder and, was a co-owner of this organization that basically runs entirely on code. And, everyone around the world that participated would be making decisions together about what this company would build and do. And kind of a long story to go into the details, but it basically blew up because there was a bug in the code that was running it, and someone hacked it and stole a bunch of money, and everyone freaked out, and they kind of like locked it down and went through this process of trying to figure out, what do? We can like roll back to the version of the company before the money was stolen, but we'd all have to like agree to do that as a group, or we can just accept that there was a bug in the code, and since we agreed that the company was just going to be based on this code, then we should just kind of move forward from here. And so, when there was a huge argument about this, but basically the point is that they forgot about human relationships, and that you can't just build a system based on kind of complete disconnection and complete independence and decentralization without realizing that we are animals that are flawed and that have relationships with each other that are complicated. And of course, there's going to be conflict, and there needs to be a sort of culture, like a value system around these systems that allow us to make decisions about how we want to move forward when there is conflict, when there is problems. And so I've kind of like stepped back a little bit from, technology is the answer, this is going to solve all our problems, to like really new culture creation and redefining our value system as a society and as humanity is like the number one thing that we need to be working on right now. And, I've heard this stated also by, for example, AI researchers who are, sure that we're going to have sentient artificial intelligences in the next 30 years or whatever. And, they could be sort of these more intelligent than us post-human beings that, may go way beyond what we can envision and have a lot of power, and potentially a power to destroy us or control us. And so, the first thing to do before we build these AIs is to come up with a value system that we can teach them, that actually is about, how do we work together as a global community to create a world that works for everyone. And from that basis, then I'm not as worried about whatever happens in technology, because it's all going to be coming from a value system that is sort of more based on peace and harmony and oneness. So it's kind of been where my thinking about what I want to work on in the world and what's the next things to focus on has headed from kind of, initially thinking, climate change is the most important thing to be focusing on right now, obviously, to, maybe we can't really resolve our climate issues without first working, changing capitalism and changing our economic system that requires constant growth. And, maybe we can't actually redesign our economic system without a culture that changes people's relationships with each other and with money and with the world.
So what's the thing before that? Okay, so maybe we can't reprogram culture in order to create a new set of like incentives for globally beneficial behavior and then we bottom out in that sort of network where individual and collective are code-defining, right? It's like the last person that I just spoke with, Susan Molnar, is an educator. She works with a lot of kids. And, it's this thing about anytime I speak to a teacher, it's like, well, we're building the future one mind at a time, just plugging away. But then again, you're also acting as that environment. You're acting as the educational surround within which these young people are raised and encouraged to adopt those new attitudes. So it is, when you get to that point of like, how is it that we actually start to steer our values in a direction that's necessary but not sufficient as a prerequisite for all of these other social changes? It's like, that's where it gets really well, and of course, culture, the beginning of culture is cult, and I really get really nervous whenever you talk about like reprogram, changing culture in some way where it feels like you want to tell someone what to do or how to behave, because I think it's also really important to have a diversity of culture, and there's so many, ideas of how to be in the world that can be successful and are beautiful and important to maintain. At the same time, it's pretty clear that the dominant culture, sort of Western culture, or even just the majority of our civilization is designed in such a way that if it continues as it's going right now, we are going to destroy the planet's ability to support us. And, there's going to be a lot of death, a lot of destruction, and we may even blink out as a species. It's definitely possible. So, I think there's a lot of angles to work on. And I think that
high level systemic change, economic systems change is really important. I think political work is really important. I think technology and, building tools that can bring carbon out of the atmosphere and, work on this sort of climate piece is really important. I think a lot of individual work, like personal growth work on each one of us doing our own work to resolve the things in us that prevent us from kind of living our most enlivened selves and bringing our gifts into the world is really important, because then we can kind of share our inspiration and our energy with the people around us. But yeah, on some level, I think there are some like really fundamental things that do need to shift in our culture if we're going to continue to succeed on this planet and thrive. And the person that has articulated this best for me is Charles Eisenstein.
Definitely.
Sacred Economics and the more beautiful world our hearts know is possible. And he kind of talks about this ascent of our civilization and why we are where we're at. And he boils down his fundamental idea of the core things that have led to our culture being the way that they are now. That didn't used to be the case before kind of like agriculture and our current modern civilization, is this idea of the separate individual self. That's like, so fundamental to a lot of spiritual traditions that have arisen in the last several thousand years, and obviously our economic system that tells us that the best way to be is a sort of selfish person who's getting as much as we can for ourselves. That not only best for us, but it's best for society, right? In this competitive marketplace that's going to produce the most value. It's going to create more wealth that in theory will then trickle down to everyone else. And in some ways it's true. Like I think capitalism has created a lot of wealth. It's just completely unequally distributed and has reached a point where we're out of, it's such an extractive system that we're out of resources. We're going to destroy the planet if it continues. And so now it's time for something different. And so the key change that needs to happen there from this selfish individualistic way is to remember how interdependent and interconnected we actually are on this planet. Obviously, in our communities and in our cities, it's easier to see, but really, our actions have such a direct impact on so much of the planet. And remembering, on so many different levels, you can think about and reconnect with this idea and feeling of oneness with the planet, with this sort of ecosystem of our world. And it's a very different mindset when you think from that state of being of like, oh yeah, my actions actually do impact the people around me and the world. So that's kind of the first big switch, is the separation to oneness. And the next is from this feeling of scarcity to realizing that there is abundance. From scarcity, it's easy to be greedy because there isn't enough for everyone. And so you better get as much as you can for yourself, or you're going to be the one that gets left behind. But this planet has so much abundance, and we have built the technology that we need to provide for everyone's basic needs across this planet. I fully believe that. And it's just a sort of political issue to decide that we actually want to live in a society on a planet where everyone's basic needs are taken care of. Political issue and a kind of like crisis of imagination, I'd say, where we don't think that that's possible, but in reality it really is. And it's almost like I get really sometimes like so passionate about how it's such a simple switch, this mindset switch that needs to happen of like individualistic to communitarian to interconnected and scarcity to abundance. And yet it's so hard because we're embedded deep in a culture and deep in systems where it's scary to let go of what our society tells us we need to be doing, going along the treadmill of school to job to building up savings for retirement for your kids to money and stuff is the thing that's going to provide us safety and security and happiness. And trying to like step out of that and be one of the pioneers to do that is scary. So it's like a simple switch, but it's also really hard to make that happen on a large scale. So I think like all these layers of work are important, and the work we can do in ourselves, the work we can do in our communities, and then systemic work like fighting for a universal basic income. As an example, large scale economic systemic policy change would be so powerful in helping create this shift, because immediately it frees up people's energies to not just be focused on putting food on the table every day, and it lets them be empowered to pursue their dreams and find a job they like and get educated. And it's empowering. It's like our current social safety net, it tells people like, you are not good enough right now. We're going to give you some money for a little while to get back on your feet, but we're going to watch everything you do because we don't trust you.
Yeah.
And switching to this sort of just universal income where everybody got their base amount every year is kind of like society saying, because you're a human on this planet, we think you deserve to live. We trust you to use this money to figure out how to, best support yourself and move forward and provide for yourself and contribute to the world. And I think it's just such a different mindset that people don't really know how big of a change it would be.
So, this is an interesting thing because I started out deeply skeptical of universal basic income, not to the degree that it's not a good idea, but just that it became so difficult. It started for me being so difficult imagining how it would actually be implemented.
Right.
And then more recently, I read a talk that was given by, of all people, Lynn Rothschild, who said to, I forget who it was like an IMF, very powerful globalist influencers. And her message in this talk that I read was that due to the totally unbalanced accumulation of the wealth that we've created, due to the tilting game board that's moving the power away from labor and toward capital, the people that own the server farms.
Yeah.
And then due to, the related trend in technological unemployment, that they're going to lose the foundation of their wealth, which is the consumer base, if they don't do something about it. That actually, it's like the entire system, ironically, the entire system requires a middle class. Yeah. It requires consumers who are spending money and feeding into this engine of ingenuity that capitalism claims to be. And so she was actually saying, maybe we should actually provide some sort of basic income to these people just so that they can continue to buy stuff. Because otherwise, who are we making products for? Who are we ruling if if all of these people die and then like the whole tower falls over? You know? So there's a strange sense in which it seems that the process of the shit hitting the fan for everyone right now includes that I don't want to call it like a deus ex machina, but it does seem like the surprise implementations are actually going to come from the places that we least suspect them here, which is from like the barons of industry or post-industry or...
Yeah, I think there is some concern there. The way that a basic income is implemented is really important. And there are ways it could be implemented that wouldn't actually be creating a better world.
Talk about that for a second. What's the nightmare UBI situation?
Well, it's kind of just what you were saying. And I honestly am not going to be able to articulate well enough sort of implementation details of how it might work. But, there's a lot of experimentation that still needs to happen. But, there's an argument that a basic income could be sort of co-opted by neoliberal capitalism to do kind of just what you're saying, is to flood the market with more money so that people can continue to be consumers and continue to buy more stuff and continue to grow the economy in a way that is not sustainable. And it would be almost like, first of all, it would be a way to eliminate a lot of the other social safety nets, because you could say, oh, we'll just do a basic income, and then people need to be able to figure out stuff on their own. So it's almost could be reinforcing this, American vision of everyone can pull themselves up by their bootstraps. Now that you have a basic income, you can do anything. And people worry about also it could just cause inflation. Prices will just go up. There's a lot of arguments against that, but I think it does need to be implemented in such a way that it's not taking away from healthcare as a goal, universal healthcare as a goal. Mental health assistance, I think, that's really important. And it's not about, let's just replace all of our other social safety nets with this cash grant and then we're done and there's no more government needed. It's about agreeing as a society that we value everyone's life and everyone deserves a shot to make something of their life and is trusted to do something well with that. And society is still going to have your back, if you are mentally ill and need some support or have a major accident and need medical care. So, I think there's going to be some battles fought about implementation, because one reason I feel that basic income is a good first step is actually because I think that it is very doable in the next decade, even in this country, because it is supported by the left who wants to alleviate poverty and reduce inequality. It's supported by libertarians who want less government, who want, currently welfare requires a lot of bureaucracy and people watching over you. And so we can eliminate government. And economists on the right are even in support because, kind of what you were just talking about. It keeps money flowing through the system. So there's a lot of support, but then there'll be the battles about the actual implementation details. And that's going to be really interesting to watch in the coming years in different countries as they explore it. And so again, it comes down to this culture question for me. It's are we going to be implementing this from a place where we're still in short-term thinking, focused on profit, focused on the kind of current system power dynamics and the people in charge wanting to maintain their power, or are we going to be focused on how do we redesign our world for everyone? And from there, how we do these implementations will really dramatically change.
Yeah, I guess, again, it just comes back to that issue of even universal basic income as a technology can be weaponized. And if it's not emerging out of the correct value set, if it's not coming into the culture, landing in a way that it's, that's actually, I don't know if are you a science fiction guy?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So there was Charles Stross wrote a novel called Singularity Sky. I think that was his first novel. And in this book, there's a culture of, post-singularity, interplanetary merchant society that moves from system to system, and their interest is in acquiring basically the intellectual property of a particular civilization and then moving on. But in the process of doing so, they make these deals where they offer this extraordinary wealth to one of their target civilizations that ends up destroying the civilization because it is their interaction, even though it feels like exactly what these people want. Oh yes, we're acquiring all of these profound superpower technologies, but it ends up disrupting it so violently that there's nobody left over at the end of it. It's to sort of stand here on the edge of the woo spectrum here. I've always thought about that with respect to why it seems to take so long for us to implement certain technological solutions. If it really is, as the conspiracy theorists claim, and free energy is being deliberately suppressed by a ruling class, might it not be for good reasons? Might it not be because we are not spiritually and psychologically prepared to handle unlimited energy at the fingertips of every 13-year-old, every despotic local gangster, it's just these, in a way it's kind of lucky. We're kind of lucky that we're not getting there as quickly as we want.
Yeah. I hear you, and then I would kind of argue the opposite in some ways. I still think we need to slow down a lot. In the age of the number of leaks we've seen happen, and just in the last couple of weeks of this election, I would say it'd be pretty hard to hide something of that magnitude. And I think we are still moving forward in ways that we're not prepared for. Drones, AI, 3D printing, all these things, virtual reality, and all these things are going to have a huge impact self-driving cars, huge impact on society that I don't think we're ready for and has not been thought through to the degree that it needs to be before widespread implementation has happened or is happening or will happen in the near future. So as much as possible, I think we actually do need to slow down both, the sort of growth mindset, but, and while I'm very much a technology person and believe in the power of technology, and I think there are many things that are going to, new technologies that are going to continue to contribute to creating the more beautiful world. No matter what, I think we need to slow down and take some breaths and reevaluate what we're doing here before we plunge forward. Yeah, have you read the Nexus trilogy?
I read the first book. Explain this to listeners too, just so that they, or like the basic, the gist of it.
This trilogy by Ramez Nam, as maybe is how you say his name.
I think so, yeah.
Set in 2040, and basically there's a drug that I think is made up of little like nano machines that goes into your brain and can be programmed to provide initially just kind of psychedelic experiences or brain boosting or memory boosting, and then gets further developed to allow for connection to the internet and connection to other people's brains and sort of telepathy. And he does a good job of envisioning how this might affect the world, and it's a really like fascinating concept to think about. Okay, well, we have this new technology, now it's going to get used by all these different factions around the world who have different ideas, and there's the people who are trying to create global unity and oneness through the monks who are like using it to help them meditate, and there's the American government that's wanting to use it to control people and prevent it from spreading and only use it for themselves and create super soldiers. And so it's like it's just another technology in the end, even though it's so powerful. And on the one hand, I think it's pretty hard to slow down the rate of this technology, and we have to kind of accept it's just going to keep happening, but all the more reason to try and work on the social technologies and work on how we live together and what our value systems are alongside it as quickly as possible to match the rate of progress that's happening on the sort of technology side. So, then that maybe could bring us back to some of the other topics we were potentially wanting to discuss, like Tamera, this community I visited in Portugal, I think is a really good example of people who are doing this work. And I'm also happy to talk about some of the thoughts and ideas of how to create this culture in our daily lives, in our communities that I think are interesting, or that I'm starting to explore more.
With respect to Tamera, because I read that piece that you wrote also on core lessons in community building from Tamera, and you mentioned in that a big part of Tamera is their emphasis on redesigning or healing the relational dynamic, interpersonal relationships, and specifically like romance, like love and sexuality. Yeah. And basically that we can't live, that we're not going to have peace between nations without peace between the sexes. But you question whether the kind of community that you seek to build needs to place the same kind of emphasis on that, or there was some concerns about the relative weight of that specific issue. And I don't know, I'm just curious to see where is it that you think like intimate relationship and sexuality falls into this larger conversation?
Yeah, I mean, maybe I'll take a step back for a moment and just explain high level a little bit about Tamera. And I think it connects to some of the things we were talking about earlier, and sort of how we're raised and the environment that we're in has such an effect on who we are and how we express ourselves in the world. And also, one of the things that is really interesting about Tamera to me as a community is their level of commitment to community and to the work they're doing together above and beyond kind of individual freedom. I think they're a really good example of this, people committing to community, this particular community, but also to the sort of global work that this community is trying to create, and putting that ahead of whatever specific other individual goals they have, but then that kind of leading to them having a more fulfilling life and a more joyful life where they are able to pursue their passions and within the kind of like context of this community. So Tamera was formed as sort of a germ in Germany 40 years ago. And the founder, Dieter Doom, wanted to figure out how to create a peaceful world. Like, he was part of the student movement in Germany in, I guess, the 60s and 70s, which didn't really succeed. And he was like, well, why isn't this working? Why are we not able to come together to create a more harmonious, peaceful world? So for 40 years, this community has been trying to explore this question in every area. So they look into how do we live more in harmony with the planet through, permaculture and solar and, just different kinds of technologies that are more sustainable. But yeah, they do a lot of work on the sort of social, interrelational, interpersonal dynamics. And being there feels really amazing because the people there it's just like if you get to feel what it's like to be in a culture, in an environment where people are happy and sort of in harmony in a different way with each other and the world. And it's not that they're like always happy. Like issues come up, they process and all the time, but they process them in such a way that they don't sort of linger and fester and lead to big blow up conflicts and fights that can fracture the community. So, they have really amazing processes, in particular this process called Forum, where they do a lot of sharing and, community processing of issues and interpersonal issues and emotional stuff. And definitely a huge piece of that is the way that they process and interact with and relate to romance and to sex and partnership. And it is, their philosophy, on one level, I'm fully on board with it. I think, the way that they describe it is they're working for a world where there's love free from fear. They'll call it free love as well, but it's kind of like a triggering phrase that has a lot of different connotations.
From, the kind of free love where you at Woodstock.
Yeah.
It's like a different.
But it's an iteration of that on some level, right? It includes non-monogamy for most people most of the time there. But the goal is not like, have as much sex as you can. The goal is to have as much love and intimacy and connection in your life as possible in an authentic way, and not be hiding things from one another, from your partners, from your friends, from your community, and not be living from a fearful place where you're unable to express your desire and to find the type of connection and relationship that you want to have in your life. So I think that, and I'm happy to go into some more details about that, but I think that they're really right on in the way of being that they've kind of discovered and explored and continue to explore. I just think that it's also really hard, and it's a big step from our current culture to that. And it really requires a supportive community that's all kind of on board with this vision and prepared to process jealousy and process shame and process the types of issues that come up in interpersonal relationship, especially when it comes to sex and love, in a new way. And our current society can be very repressed around sex and very repressed around attraction and desire and all these things. And so it's very triggering, and it's intense for people to try and step into a new mindset around that. And so I think my only question was, is it necessary as a sort of early step or process for communities that I want to build, and that a lot of the people in my greater community are talking about building, to include that from the beginning? Or is it something that we can sort of move towards over time and slowly integrate and slowly explore? So that was really where my question.
You kind of have to seduce free love,
Yeah,
it's like
exactly.
There's an interesting thing there with respect to the technocultural surround that supports this. I don't know if you're familiar with, there's a wiki called Sex 3.0 that I've seen circulating online. And it makes the case that the contemporary conversation around non-monogamy is in large part due to the way that the distributed agency of our technological infrastructure expresses itself in human psychology. So basically they're saying that what we take to be the normal human relational mode is due specifically to our embeddedness in a society that is rooted and shaped by agriculture, the enclosure of land, the cultivation of resources, the paternal inheritance of wealth, the ownership of one's wife and children as an extension of the ownership of one's livestock, and that predating that, you get the Sex at Dawn, Chris Ryan thing, which is predating that. It seems that the self-construct of nomadic foraging or hunter-gatherer society lended itself to something more like this, where the ego boundaries between members of a community are less rigid. More of the wealth, the wealth is shared. There's not such a clear notion on property. And that seems to be reviving in light of the way that the internet has created all of these opportunities for peer-to-peer architecture, as well as a more distributed sense of self, a more non-local sense of self. And that therefore it's like that we're exploring a wider set of possible personality strategies or cultural strategies now that include monogamy as a preference and also include non-monogamy, that include, there's just so many different relational styles now, and that it is in part because, more and more of human nature is becoming digital or is becoming so deeply informed by digital society. And one of the properties of the digital world is that everything is shared, that like as soon as it's online, it's immediately copied and shared and moved around.
Yeah.
And so this, again, it gets back to this issue of environment versus will. And like, I wonder maybe if it's not so much a prerequisite, although it's nice it's nice if you were able to start an intentional community from that place, but it's maybe less so that it's a prerequisite or a necessary initial component of a community, so much as it is that in a nudist colony, nobody has the same kind of body issues that we do in the city. And that maybe as we become more and more transparent to one another through this sort of inevitable march of internet tracking and surveillance and covalence, that we're just going to get more and more comfortable with that kind of totally transparent and authentic relationship that's grounded in a sharing economy rather than, so like our relational mode actually sort of, it may be like shaped or emerge out of the ways that we're learning to relate to one another in other domains,
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it definitely sort of emerged, in their case, in Tamera's case, and I think in general, this concept of free love emerges from transparency and from trust. And I think the commitment that they made to themselves and to their community was to building complete trust with each other, like the foundation of their community. And I think the reason that they really work is that they really trust each other. And the reason that they trust each other is because they're transparent. They share what's going on with the community. They have, pretty much every day of the week, they gather in these sharing circles and communicate to each other what they're feeling, what they're thinking, who they're attracted to, where there's conflict in a relationship. It's all kind of out in the open. They're really taking this, and definitely you see this happening more and more on the internet on a global scale of people sharing on Facebook, sharing deeper, more vulnerable things. But in this local context with a smaller group of people in the same place over time, it gets really deep, and especially since they're all so committed to it. They really all know each other incredibly well, and they are committed to sharing. And so from that kind of emerges this, when we are really sharing our full selves, we're attracted to lots of people. That's a natural human, primal thing, is to feel attraction to people. And it can be just sort of physical, sexual, but it can also go deeper than that. And I think we have a lot of people in our lives that we feel connected to and want to have a relationship with. And so, first of all, just acknowledging that is scary in a society where monogamy is the norm. So many people think that if their partner so much as looks at another woman and has attraction or, imagines connecting with them in some way, that is cheating. That is breaking the agreements of our monogamous, marriages. And so it's just not true, right? It's not authentic. It requires us to be not expressing our authentic selves. And so I do think this love free from fear philosophy really just emerged from trying to figure out how to live in a way where we can trust each other. And that, requires this really deep sharing. So I am curious to see how the internet and how the type of sharing that happens on the internet starts to affect culture in that regard. Even you see so many leaks about celebrity, this person cheating on that person. It's in a way, it's horrible. And there's this, deep invasion into people's lives, and everyone is thinking about celebrities and not thinking about their own lives. But in another way, it starts to almost normalize if there's so much cheating happening, or, maybe there's something else going on, and we need to reevaluate how we think about marriage and connection and relationship. It's interesting. Or cheating and divorce. I mean, I don't know what it is. 50% of people of marriages and in divorce or infidelity. It's definitely clear that our current structures around romantic relationship are not the only way to live, and not serving many of us in being happy in our lives and our relationships.
I mean, if they are, as that wiki argues, if they are the consequence of an economic mode, then it would make sense that an economic mode that doesn't actually suit the human being would lead to relational styles that don't suit the human being, or at least that no longer suit the human being, like in light of everything that we now know. But, I mean,
or don't suit all human beings all the time, right? Maybe some people are happy and have fulfilling long-term marriages, but it's not serving a lot of us.
Well, that's actually, when I met you, I was reading William Irwin Thompson's book, The American Replacement of Nature. And he makes this distinction in that book between, he says every world age, every historical epic has this tension between two different kinds of people. And he says, if you look at the industrial world, it was between the industrialist and the artist. That as soon as we learned to differentiate culture and nature, then some of us wanted to dominate nature with culture. And then some of us wanted to return to nature with this retro romantic mode that, this delusion, honestly, a delusion that we had actually ever left it, He's like, but both of those strategies are obsoleted by the post-industrial information society. And now what we're dealing with are the technocrats and the mystics. And so he says, like, in this new balance, we have this sort of, we can hold the mystic up against what he calls the moralist. It's like, if you think about this in terms of the strategies that people take to change, to like future shock, to everything's happening too fast, that some of us are going to want to dig in our heels and settle down and put up a fence and really dedicate ourselves to a particular tradition, a sense of, anchoring ourselves in lineage and moral values, and that others are going to be inclined or are naturally predisposed to stepping out into this new space and anchoring their home. Again, it's kind of like touches on that digital nomadism thing. It's like that in a way that this is an old tension. This is the tension between like a mosaic or like Aaron, between the mystical wanderer and the people that actually like settle and worship inside of a temple, rather than in the wilderness. And then so you have this thing about, like he says about the mystics, that they can't settle down, in a sense that there's the attempt to simplify life, to make it manageable, to ground it all in one set of values that doesn't have an opposing set, that's doomed to failure, because the commitment to this embrace of the world and all of its dizzying complexity requires the acceptance of one's self as other, one's capacity for evil, the acknowledgement that there is no one place that is truly more your home than another place. At this point, I'm kind of lost the through there. But I mean, it does seem like all of this is at play in, that there is sort of we're moving out of like one right way and into an entire ecosystem of strategies.
Yeah, but the thing that I keep coming back to, though, which is a tension there, is I feel like there does need to be some, or almost that there doesn't need to be, but that there is some like core, deep values that we can and do share. And I'm really curious about this because I'm totally on board with a sort of plurality of belief systems being really important, and also sort of flexibility and adaptability and resilience being also really important for our continued evolution as a species and ability to, be on this planet. At the same time, are we basically then saying, okay, we have to give up on trying to come to some global agreements and some, larger community agreements about how we want to live on the planet, and then see what happens? And, maybe maybe we're not going to figure it out, and maybe we're going to just have our brief shining moment on this planet as a species. I think
a rainforest doesn't need shared values. A rainforest has, if you talk about like Charles Eisenstein, making the case that we're moving out of weeds growing in an empty lot, this unchecked expansion of capitalism, into a mature rainforest type ecosystem where we've found a way to integrate destruction and decay. And it may be that we just really do need to trust the transcultural tension between perspectives here. It's sort of like an upgraded, postmodernized version of that, trusting the invisible hand of the marketplace. That maybe there's something more humane than that, but maybe there really isn't. I don't know.
Right. Well, then the question is, where is the place for agency? Like, I certainly don't think that we should just kind of sit back and let things flow and follow what feels right in the moment entirely. Like, I think it's important to have a vision for ourselves and our own lives and for how we want to see the world, and try and move towards that as much as we can in our own life at the very least. And so it's like there is this interesting tension between kind of being in the moment, in the complexity, kind of flowing with it, exploring, and having a direction and having an agency and a goal. That's an interesting tension on like an individual level that I definitely explore. And on the bigger scale, and I think one of the main shifts that I actually do see happening as I explore the world and explore different cultures and different festivals and gatherings is this kind of like almost embracing and inclusion of this complexity and these tensions and this diversity. And a huge piece of it actually, I think, is trying to embrace the feminine, right? It's like we've been so, the last whatever thousands of years have really been patriarchal and dominated by masculine thinking. And it goes back a little bit to the tension you were bringing up much earlier, where you're talking about the kind of disattachment from some Buddhist traditions who are really focused on being completely unattached and completely just in the now, in the present. And I think that's a very powerful thing, but it's sort of like it's not really inclusive of the whole of experience and the whole of what's going on in the universe. And I think there's been I've seen a lot of spiritual teachers recently trying to bring in what feels like the more feminine energy and is more embodied and more kind of expressive and inclusive of experience, of somatic experience. And Tantra is kind of like where a lot of where this comes from. And I do think that one of the answers that is really important for our society to get back to a sort of imbalanced place with each other in the world is to bring back in the feminine, bring back in our connection with the earth, with sort of our bodies, with this other kind of energy. And through this tension that has been very like one-sided for a while, very like masculine and mental and controlled, and finding a balance in this tension, I think that's a way that we can kind of like embrace the fullness and the complexity of everything that's happening in a balanced way that I believe will kind of lead to a much more harmonious way of being on the planet. And it brings back to what Tamera is trying to do, and a lot of their work in relationships and sex and love is about empowering the feminine and creating a culture where there's a sort of balance between the two. So I'm not saying there's an answer there either, but I do think that there are some like real important steps in our lives and in our communities that we can make to find a better balanced way of being on this planet. And yeah.
Well, I mean, on that note, ever since I read Kevin Kelly's book, The Inevitable, and he makes the case that really we're moving out of an age of answers and into an age of questions where like answers are just on tap, but like coming up with a really good question is what actually creates value in this, the world that we're transitioning into. So I'm at a point now where I'm like, answers, so 20th century. It's more interesting. And especially with this podcast specifically, I want to provide really good questions, like the questions that we're getting into here. And I want these questions explored by our community of listeners, and for this to be the seed of an inquiry rather than a dispatch from on high.
Yeah, absolutely.
That doesn't really serve anybody or it doesn't serve as many people as it does to actually just to get the conversation going. And so this is where I'd like to, because we cannot end this without getting into Inheritance Day. Because that was actually when I heard you talk about that at Boom, that's when I knew I needed you on the podcast. So please tell people a little bit about what this idea is and how it's taking shape and where it's headed.
So, I've talked a lot about over the last, hour plus, this deep feeling that we need to be creating a new culture, even for ourselves. I want to be living in a way where I feel empowered, where I feel like I'm living my passion, and I'm happy, I'm joyful, and it's sustainable for me and for my community, and the people around me are happy. So, in thinking about how to do this, one of the ideas we've come up with is, I think this is sort of obvious, that the way that culture gets created and passed on and continues is through traditions and through stories, sort of like the narratives we tell ourselves about why we're here, what we're doing as people and as humans, and then the rituals that we create that tell that story to, and sort of reinforce it over time and can pass it down to our children. So we had this opportunity to create a new ritual, and it was part of this event in San Francisco called the Urban Eating League that a friend of mine started, where there's 5 different houses that are all kind of host houses, and they cook a meal for different groups of eaters that are coming around throughout the night and spending half an hour at each house and rating each house on their food and their creativity. And there's always a theme. And so it's this really like fun kind of like competition, but in the most fun possible way.
It's like speed dating for slow food.
Something like that. But everybody gets in on the theme, and the eaters dress up, and they have different teams that do different activities, and the houses create these experiences. And so we were a host, and the theme this time was Utopia/dystopia. And so, being who I am, obviously after this conversation, I wanted to try and envision a utopia and try and help people see that possibility. And so a few of my close friends and I sat down, and we came up with this idea of imagining that we were 150 years in the future and had created a world where, everyone's needs were met. We had solved climate change. We were living in harmony and balance with the earth. We had eliminated injustice and inequality and racism and sexism and all this stuff. And in that future, there's a new holiday called Inheritance Day, which is honoring the ancestors who kind of got us to that point. And so, people came into our house. We had this whole beautiful setup in my living room, and we initiated them into this, we're in 2166, and welcome to, Inheritance Day. Like, thanks for joining us for our particular Inheritance Day celebration. And so each course of the meal, it was kind of like Passover. Each course of the meal honored something that had, our ancestors had accomplished, like, the clean energy revolution, where we ate these black sesame covered falafel balls that represented coal, and this black lentil that represented petroleum. And as we ate them, we were like recarbonizing ourselves and the planet. Or, the second course was these little food pyramids with all the food groups that represented a universal basic income worldwide, everyone's basic needs being met. And the third one, we were chewing these bitter cacao nibs that kind of represented the pain of oppression over centuries. And they like drank this sweet spiced milk that represented sort of overcoming all forms of oppression and creating sort of just equal society. And then the last course, there was this big stew that represented the earth coming together as kind of a global community and agreeing to figure out how to live together in harmony. And we did different little fun games as part of it. Like during the course with the food pyramids, we did a bun dance to celebrate abundance. And we, got up and shaked our booties. And then at the end, we did this kind of unity sound healing ceremony that was the sort of final bells, because there were different like bells for every course. So it was really fun. And actually, one of the other really interesting things, it was on December 12th, and it was the day that the Paris Accords were signed. So we were actually playing a live clip recorded earlier that day of the president of France talking about how the world had, December 12th, 2015 will go down in history as the first time the world came together to do something about climate change. And we were saying, remember back then when like the first Inheritance Day, when, the world was just starting to come together and figure some things out. So people, they loved it. They had fun with it. And then I really got the sense and feedback that they left with a feeling of like, oh, wow, like, okay, how would I be living my life? And I gave people this question as they left the house. So imagine you were those ancestors 150 years ago. What would you be doing with your life right now to try and move us, towards this better way of being, or more in balance way of being? So it was fun, and people loved it, and it was something that we decided we had to do again. And this year we're gonna just make it like a holiday that we celebrate and tell other people about it, and try and get people around the country and the globe to celebrate Inheritance Day with us, both as a kind of futurist game, but also, honoring our own ancestors and everything that has led us to this amazing world that we live in today.
Has the thought experiment of Inheritance Day led to, have you gotten any feedback, or have you noticed in your own life that taking this as an object of contemplation has led to any profound insights or changes in your behavior, the way that you navigate and live in the world? Or
I think that it really reinforced this kind of hope and optimism that I have, that we can figure out how to live on this planet and with each other without violence. Yeah, I mean, I do think that I've started to guide myself by kind of that question, like, okay, what can I do to better create nonviolence, peace, harmony, connection, intimacy, love into my life and into the world's life for my friends, for my community, and my children. And I obviously, coming up with this idea, already was thinking that way on some level, but doing it and seeing how powerful it was, and how much I think it did influence friends, and people told me that it had an impact, and sort of conversations that we have about this, with this sort of hopeful vision and energy that just is focused pointing towards a hopeful vision of the future, is really uplifting. And it makes me happier, given the kind of crazy state of the world today, and the fact that we've already crossed some really significant points where we're not going to be able to go back in terms of climate change, and we're already losing species every day. And at the same time, I'm still feel very able to hold on to this hopeful vision, and it really does motivate me and keep me energized and excited to do work that feels meaningful in the world. So yeah. And the other thing that it really reinforced in my group of friends is that we want to do more of this, and we want to create more rituals for our community that we can do over time, and kind of reinvent our holidays. And maybe Valentine's Day becomes the day of agape, where instead of thinking about just individual couple romantic love as the answer to everything and celebrating that, we celebrate love for all of our community and our friends and the world and each other, and just have a big kind of love fest. Or we have and some of these are maybe going back to more traditional holidays where we're honoring abundance through the harvest in the fall, or sort of more traditional pagan celebrations. I think getting rid of the consumerism and getting rid of the attachment to religious beliefs that many of us are not really on board with anymore, and creating a set of annual rituals, holidays that really have significance and meaning for us, and that maybe other people can adopt or enjoy or take what they want from.
Yeah, I think, insofar as we can make this recursive, and we can talk about one of the things that we have inherited from our parents' generation, would include the hard-won lesson that it doesn't really make sense to build it all from scratch. We're not going to just give everyone acid and expect a new culture to magically appear.
Yeah.
But that the real work is in, I guess we would call it reclaiming or re-territorializing what we've inherited, adapting it, accepting it. It's like even in the pre-human evolutionary process, it's not like feet just appeared. I mean, there was a fin and it was repurposed. Everything was repurposed. And so, again, it's like rather than just proliferate new holidays, there is something really appealing about repurposing the holidays that we already have. And it possibly, like you were talking about on Valentine's Day, you scratch the surface, you scratch off the embossed foil of that Valentine's card. And underneath that consumerist appropriation is the original heathen holiday.
Yeah.
In which my understanding of the origin of Valentine's Day was that it was based on a Roman holiday in which people just sort of had sex in public. That it was that the youth would like congregate in public spaces and just freely and publicly express their affections. Again, it's like one of these things where we may actually be seizing the holiday in its original spirit out of the jaws of like the Coca-Cola Santa Claus version of it.
Yeah.
And then also, I don't know if you're like a Rudolf Steiner guy, but
a little bit.
There's his whole thing with Michael Maas and reclaiming not just Christmas and Easter, but also St. John's Day and Michaelmas in the summer and fall, and using these as ritual observances for each of the 4 seasons, and this much deeper layer of the observances of the way that energy expands out of the land up into the flowering trees and clouds in the summer, and then returns down into the soil, and then the sky becomes clear again, and we become transparent to the sort of transpersonal mystery of our lives in the winter.
Yeah.
This whole thing about Bucky Fuller saying that the further forward we want to look, the further back we have to start.
Yeah.
And that inheritance day, if we're gonna imagine 150 years in the future, then we got to at least look back 150 years and thank all of the people that got us to this point.
Oh my God, yeah. I think that's so important. And one of the things that's been really exciting to me to see out in the world this year in particular, I've noticed it at Boom Festival, Symbiosis, even at Bioneers, so many indigenous elders being brought into these environments, and many of whom have never been to a festival. And there's just a lot more growing interest in reconnecting with these ancient wisdom traditions that many of these cultures do know how to live in harmony with the planet and with the environment around them, and have a lot of wisdom that has been lost or is being lost. And so I absolutely agree that looking back is as important as looking forward, and trying to kind of integrate. I think integration is one of the best words to describe what we're trying to do, where it's like, take the pieces of all these wisdom traditions that make sense and that work for us and for our communities and for the world, and integrate them into our own version that makes sense for us in our culture, but that has this kind of like balance between these different tensions we've been talking about, and can lead us to this more balanced way of being.
Right on, dude. So I don't know, that feels like a fairly round point. It's like we've managed to touch on all of the bases I wanted to cover.
Yeah.
I don't know, is anything else really alive for you right now? Where's all of your passion going right now?
Well, my passion right now has been how do I apply all of my visions and ideas and things to my own life. Right now, I'm kind of reinventing everything in my life. What do I work on? How do I live the life that I want to be living and that I talk about creating? There's kind of a lot up in the air and a lot of exciting and also daunting energy to sort of manifest now. A lot of these things that feel very real and rich. But actually one final thing that I listened to your talk, the techno shamanism talk.
The Moog Fest talk, yeah.
Yeah. And I had this one idea that had occurred to me a few months ago that I thought you might appreciate, that actually feels like it kind of relates to what we were just talking about, this looking back, looking forward, finding like this integrated whole. And it came up, you were talking about, this idea that maybe we're in a simulated universe. And, because we are likely going to be able to simulate a universe in the not too distant future with our technology, that probably means that we're not the first ones that could ever do that. And so it's almost certainly true that we are in a simulation.
Oh no, we're the first. Beings. We're the first for sure.
Well, whatever's true, it's an interesting idea to explore. And so I had this thought the other day, pondering this idea where, if we're in a simulation, then probably whoever created this simulation is watching us, right? Is measuring the simulation, is like paying attention to how it's developing.
Gross, but okay.
So, we have these watchers. You could even think of them as gods, right? In the sense that they like created our universe, and maybe could even influence it in ways that we're unaware of. And, in the future, maybe we're going to simulate some universes and we'll be the kind of like gods of these future universes. And so, think of it, if there are these people watching us, then they're learning from us, right? I mean, as much as they like are the ones who created this universe, at the same time, they're just letting the simulation unfold, and they're kind of learning and watching us, and whatever we're doing is probably potentially influencing how they're working in their universe. So I really like this idea of thinking about how we're kind of like influencing our creators through our actions in some way. So not only are we creating, and everything that we do, we're sort of influencing the future, but in some way you could think of us as sort of influencing the gods, right? And the fun like phrase is this kind of, we're part of this fractal godhood where, there's potentially these people who created our universe and are watching us, but also being influenced by us, who are then influencing the people above them, and sort of all the way down in this sort of backwards, forwards, circular fractal godhood. It's really fun.
Then you get into the issue of the event horizon and how is information actually escaping a black hole? Like if we really are like inside of that boundary, can we be observed? Are we making universes all the time and we don't even recognize them because I do like that though. Like I like the notion that when you get into the practicality of it, like why make a simulation? Well, clearly it's because you intend to learn something from it, right?
Right.
So I mean, that means that all of us have at least this potential to regard our lives as informative to beings that we might otherwise take this sort of terrified Cthulhu type response to. It's like, no, God is actually very interested in what food you post to Instagram, and
Totally. It's a fun sort of empowering way to think of our own agency and influence in the world, and also like circular. We're all interconnected, right? Including the gods.
Well, that's like the Tea Fairy. I don't know if you know her, kind of a heroic rock star psychonaut, writes for Arrowhead. And she lives her whole life. We're going to get her on the show, hopefully, pretty soon. She lives her whole life with the thought experiment. Well, if my life is of interest to these mysterious, invisible, transcendental observers, then I should really be doing everything in my power to just rock out and be as awesome as possible. And like,
exactly.
Don't I want to make good on this platform that I have to, there's like, if the future is watching, then don't you want to make sure that you say something valuable?
Exactly. I love it.
Well, thanks a lot for joining us on the show. Tibet Sprague. I'm going to post the links to some of your essays on Medium. But where else can people find your work or connect to you online?
I'm just in the beginning processes of throwing up tibetsprague.com for the first time in my life, surprisingly. So right now it's pretty basic, but I do have links to Medium and Twitter and Facebook and LinkedIn and the things that I'm doing there. So that's probably the easiest link to share, tibetsprague.com.
Cool.
And I do hope and plan to be writing a lot more in the near future as I have a little bit of time while I'm figuring out my life. Now's the time to share ideas and put some ideas into writing. So yeah, definitely looking forward to continuing all these types of conversations with anyone and everyone who wants to.
Awesome. Well, thanks so much for being on the show, and I look forward to connecting with you beyond the envelope of this recording and seeing what we and all of our friends can do to help usher forth this better world.
Totally. Thanks, Michael. Yeah, it's been really fun.
Understanding that we've got a lot more to learn. The work is not done here, and we may not ever figure it out. We probably won't figure it out.